Hey guys, Adrianne. Welcome back. Today I'm going to be sharing with you a fairly long story about my journey with my gender up to now. The main reason that I want to share my story is that there may be other people who are transgender or questioning their gender who see this and may be able to find something that's a bit relevant to them. My story is fairly unique. I think everyone who goes through a questioning phase with their gender or decides to transition all have very unique stories. I don't think there's a standard narrative. For me, it wasn't until a few years ago that I even knew what a transgender person was, or what was even possible with a gender transition. I guess if you talked about someone who was transgender to me 3 or 4 years ago, the only image I had to go off was like a 50-year-old cross-dresser like Tim Curry in the Rocky Horror Picture Show. The only other story I knew was the sort of kid on Oprah story, like a little boy who always told everyone that he knew he was a girl and dressed like a princess. And I don't think the parents or anyone around them would question that wasn't the case. So for me, when I started realizing that I wasn't comfortable with my gender, the thought of being transgender or that I'd end up transitioning just didn't make any sense to me, because I looked at these two extreme examples that I only knew of, and I just thought that isn't me at all. For one, I wasn't blatantly conscious when I was a little kid that I felt like a girl. I wasn't running around telling my mum that I felt like a girl, that I was born the wrong body. Didn't, scream and kick to be dressed like a princess like these kids I see on the news stories. So I wouldn't really say that I identified as a girl when I was a young kid, but in saying that, I didn't really identify as a boy either. I can think of a lot of instances where I felt really different to a lot of the guys. I guess when I was sort of primary school age, I didn't really identify with the other boys or seem to have the same interests that they did. I guess I felt like a bit of an alien, and I'd always say things that just seemed really odd for a boy to say, and didn't have any of the interests in the activities that they wanted to do. Like most boys, when they're young, are into sort of more physical play and like playing sports and that sort of thing. Whereas I was quite a soft, sensitive kid. I didn't want to play in any sort of physical way. I was more about sort of making friends with people, and was more about chatting and talking and sort of dressing up and playing characters and using my imagination a lot more. And I don't really want to generalise, but those are the sort of things that are a bit more typical of a young girl. One of the things that's very unique to my story is that I lost my father when I was about 3 years of age to a work accident. He was working underground as a coal miner, and then one day was suddenly killed when the roof collapsed in on him, which left me with my mum, who was still pregnant with my younger sister. Now, I know a lot of people would think that at 3 years of age I wouldn't remember a lot of this, but I think I was a lot more aware than people took for granted, and I feel like I have an almost photographic memory of a lot of the things that happened when he died. One of the things I've come to realise when I think back is that a lot of people who were dealing with their grief of losing my dad sort of dealt with it in an unconscious sense by looking at me as, I guess, like the positive part of him that was left here. I feel like a lot of people didn't see me as a different person, but as sort of a younger version of my dad. And maybe that I might grow up to be a bit like him. And being left with just my mum and my sister and no other male role models, I think a lot of people were concerned that I wouldn't grow up to be as male as I should be. Maybe that I might grow up to be quite effeminate or gay, which I realise now is just impossible. I feel like there was this sort of overwhelming push from people to make sure that I grew up to be as male as possible. I remember my grandfather talking to me not too long after my dad had passed. He sort of looked looked me in the eye and said that I'm now the man of the house and that I was supposed to make sure to look after my mum and my sister. And I think at 3 years old and feeling quite traumatised, I really took that to heart. When I was a young kid, I guess I always felt like I was obliged to prove to people that I could be as strong and as male and macho as I could be. But at the same time, it just wasn't something that came naturally to me. And I always felt like I didn't know what to do, and I'd always say the wrong stuff, and I beat myself up over it. I felt like a bit of a failure and very weak, and I had really bad self-esteem when I was a young kid. But when I think back, some of the happiest memories from my childhood were fairly atypical for a boy. I remember feeling quite normal, playing with my female cousin, doing fairly typical girl stuff like playing with dolls and dressing up and that sort of thing. I do remember that we were both really obsessed with The Little Mermaid, and that was sort of my favourite movie. I'll keep asking her to put it on each time I came over. And she was a few years older than me, and I do remember, because she had like long blonde hair and stuff, thinking that she was really pretty. And I don't think at the time I really quite understood the difference between boys and girls, but I do remember hoping that I'd grow up and look like her. Another memory I have when I was about 4 or 5 years old was being the page boy at my uncle's wedding. And the main memory I have from that is seeing the flower girl, because at that age I'd never seen anything like it before. Sort of, she was all done up in the dress and that, and I remember like just being really fascinated by it. I think I followed her around a lot during the wedding, and people in my family remember that and have joked a bit, saying that like I had a bit of a crush on her. But in reality, I was more obsessed with what she was wearing and how she looked. And I think deep down that I kind of wished that I could look like that. Another thing that I remember from that day, and it's actually quite funny that I remember this, was walking down the aisle as the page boy next to this flower girl. And when we got to the end, they had the bridesmaid and the bride on the left, and they had the groom and all the groomsmen there on the right. I remember just my eyesight went straight to the bridal party, and once again was just like really drawn into just this beautiful feminine stuff that they were wearing and how pretty they looked. I remember when I got to the end of the aisle, I turned left, made a beeline for the bridal party, and then I remember being like picked up and moved and plonked over with the groomsmen and feeling like really upset by that. And that was probably my first memory of gender dysphoria. Was like I knew where I belonged, but people sort of told me that I was wrong, and that was a really horrible feeling. Another memory, and this is probably the one that stands out to me the most, was when I was in kindergarten around Christmas time. They had like a little Christmas pageant sort of play with like Mary and Joseph and Jesus and that. And I remember they got the girls and the boys to separate, and they told the girls they were going to be angels. And like they got to go and dress up and wear like a white dress and sparkly wings and like a halo. And the boys were going to be shepherds, and they basically wore like an ugly brown dressing gown. And I remember at that point where they divided, I felt like I was just sort of stuck in the middle. I felt deep down like I should have been over with the girls, and I wanted to be an angel and I wanted to look pretty, and I just kept looking at it like quite jealous of them. And I felt also that like I didn't fit in with the boys. I didn't want to be with the boys. I didn't want to be an ugly shepherd. But on that day, I sort of like just kept my mouth shut and put the shepherd clothes on and sort of went along with it. But the whole time just looking over at the girls and wishing that I could have been on that side. And it was, I think that feeling was so strong that at the end of the class, went over to my teacher when everyone had left and sort of asked her if she'd let me be an angel. And she said yes. And yeah, that's one of the happiest memories was when we got to do the actual play and I got to wear a dress and like the angel wings and everything. And although that was like, looks very much like a boy with a 90s bowl cut, in my head I felt really pretty. And also this really warm, happy feeling like butterflies in my stomach, which is something I rarely can remember experiencing when I was a kid. So that's probably why the memory sticks out to me so much. But I do remember feeling after the fact that there was something really wrong about the fact that I felt that way, and I felt really embarrassed about it. I felt like there was this huge obligation on me to just be a normal boy and to fit in. All I could put it down to at the time was that my dad wasn't around. And I honestly believed when I was a kid that all the other boys knew how to behave and like the things they do and were the way they were because it was something that their dads had taught to them. So I repressed those feelings a lot, and I think I focused a lot more on trying to fit in as like the other boys. And so I over time sort of watched what they liked and what they'd say and how they acted. And I guess I tried to replicate that, but looking at it now, that was a very artificial sort of way to live. But a couple of years ago, I read a post by another transgender girl who talked about in the first weeks of starting school in kindergarten, she was sick with the chicken pox, so missed like the first 2 or 3 weeks. When she started school, she just didn't know how to relate to the boys, or didn't like the rough and tumble sort of play that they were into, just felt like she was always saying the wrong thing, and just didn't fit in with them. But for years and years she believed that in that first couple of weeks when she was off sick, that the teacher had sat all the kids down and taught the boys how to be boys and taught the girls how to be girls. And when I read that story, I was like, that is exactly how I felt. But for me, I felt like that sort of boy lesson was something that I missed out on because my father had passed away. And I know since I've come out that a few people have asked whether losing my dad at such a young age somehow caused me to be transgender. And the answer to that is absolutely not. The feelings I have about being more female than male is something that's very inherent to me and would have been there regardless of what happened in my life. If anything, losing my dad just taught me not to trust myself when I was young. And possibly if he was still around, I might have been one of those kids in primary school who knew that they were trans. Although being a trans kid in the 90s probably wouldn't have worked too well in my favour. And from what I've heard, the sort of person that my dad was, he was quite an open-minded, very kind person, and I think he would have been one of my best supporters if he was still here. Well, that concludes part 1 of my gender story. Stay tuned for part 2, which will cover more of my teenage years. Until then, just keep on being you. See you later.